So back in the late 70s, when I was still in middle school, my mom and dad went through a really nasty divorce. When dad disappeared for a week, mom tried to reassure me and my brother by saying he was on a work trip. But when he came home, they spent the next couple of days arguing before he left for good. Now, he didn't disappear or anything. He moved up to Crescent City into a nice house by the harbor. But since he didn't fight for custody, we got the sense that he just wasn't interested in being a dad anymore. The most he ever talked about it was when he called on my 26th birthday. Mom never had a good word to say about him after the divorce. She said he was a deadbeat, that he'd gone nuts, that he was off somewhere having a midlife crisis because he was a selfish, thoughtless a-hole. Dad laughed when I told him that, and he didn't disagree. He also apologized for being so distant, but said his life had taken a horrible turn right around the time he and Mom divorced. He said I might not understand until I was a dad myself, and that sometimes a man has to do what's right, even if it means sacrificing everything he's worked for. He sounded pretty drunk at the time, so I never put much thought or faith into what he had to say. I didn't know it then, but that was the last chance I would ever have to talk to him. Around 7 months later, Mom called me in the middle of the night. All she said was, "Your father's dead." Then she passed the phone to my brother so he could talk. Dad suffered a heart attack while swimming in his backyard pool. No one found him for a couple of days, and Mom had to go identify his body. She came home drunk in a cab and had to pick up her car the next day. We held a closed casket funeral for Dad the following week. Then my brother and I helped Mom deal with all the inheritance issues. Dad had done pretty well financially, so we were shocked to learn that he barely had anything left when he died. All he had was his car, his house, a few thousand in savings, and one other thing, a property up near Black Marble Mountain that he had built not long after the divorce. That was the biggest shock of all, because not even Mom knew he had built anything, and she knew almost everything he'd been up to after the divorce. According to the attorney Mom hired, it was a one-room log cabin on a small plot of land in Siskiyou County, about 20 miles south of a little town called Happy Camp. We could either have it evaluated and put it on the market along with his house, or the attorney could transfer the deeds and we'd be the owners of a cabin we hadn't known existed until just minutes before. Mom told the attorney to put the place up for sale, but I asked her not to be so hasty. She argued that there was nothing in that cabin but jerky wrappers and empty bottles of booze, but that didn't deter me. Later, I told her in private that I wanted to see it for myself. My brother and I didn't know all that much about what Dad had been up to, and since only one of us actually cared, it fell to me to go check the place out. I drove up in mid-November of that same year, making sure all the wildfires in the area had either burned out or been contained. But it wasn't a simple matter of driving out there and loading my car with anything of interest. Accessing the cabin took hours of hiking across unfamiliar terrain, and we grew up in a family far more familiar with spas and resorts than hiking or camping. Preparing for the trip took months of purchases and planning, and by the time I was finally ready, I remember feeling very, very apprehensive. I wanted to know what my dad had been up to out there, whether he was just a latent appreciator of the outdoors, or if there was some deeper meaning behind it all. But I never stopped to consider if maybe, just maybe, I was better off not knowing the answers to my questions. Now, I'm not talking about anything too sinister. More like I didn't want to find evidence of degenerate alcoholism, or worse, some kind of strange BDSM setup. So there was this creeping sense of apprehension as my day of departure approached. Just not nearly enough to stop me, though. And after driving out to Happy Camp, a friendly local pointed me down toward a place called Syad Valley. There was a whitewater rafting company based down there that didn't mind me leaving my car parked overnight. And from there, It was almost 5 miles of hiking toward Black Marble Mountain, and all I had to rely on was a map the attorney had obtained on my behalf. And it was hard going. I soaked my shirt with sweat, got myself lost a couple of times, and burned through so much of my water that I had to top my canteen off with stream water. And it warmed up fast, and the chlorine tablets made it taste like a swimming pool. And then, after a few more hours, the trees began to thin out, and I actually spotted the cabin in a distant clearing. And I was kind of expecting something fancy, maybe some sort of luxury man cave Dad could retreat to whenever he wanted to indulge himself. But seeing it from a distance, I could tell right away that it was anything but luxurious. It was moldy and moss-eaten, and the front was all scratched up, presumably from generations of bucks using it as a rutting post. It had one small window on the front with no glass or shutter, and the roof looked like it was on the verge of collapsing. I tried the door, thinking it was liable to fall off, but it proved surprisingly sturdy. It was thick, fitted with heavy metal hinges, and what I realized were metal panels nailed to the other side. But that only held my attention for a second or two before I turned to the cabin's interior. And when I did, my jaw dropped. Almost every surface was covered in maps of the area, and all of them had been heavily written on. There was a lot of camping-related trash scattered around it too. Spent gas canisters for the portable stove, empty cases of water, and things like that. But scattered among the maps were photographs of what I slowly realized was the same man. It was clear that this place was not newly built. Either he had renovated it or built on top of something older, but it had been there for a long time. Some photos were pinned to the walls, others were lying on the table or the nightstand, and while they were not in sequence, they seemed to show this man in a deeply disturbing state of deterioration. There were a few photos of a very happy-looking man with red curly hair, posing with family or friends. In those pictures, he looked bright and healthy. But in other photos, some of which looked like he had taken himself, he appeared increasingly tired and very gaunt, almost as if he were sick. And then there were the pictures of the red-haired man, where it looked like he did not know they were being taken. There was one of him staring into a stream, his once short hair now very long and unkempt, and another slightly blurry photo of him walking barefoot and shirtless through the trees. There were no clues to who the man was, only that someone had been using the maps to track his movements. There were small annotations with dates and times, and one of them read, "He's still here," written over a certain grid square. It looked like my dad had either been trying to find this guy or tracking his movements. But why was the question? I started to search the cabin more carefully, looking for something that might give me a clue about what Dad had been doing. But the only things I found were a very hefty-looking revolver in a desk drawer, a box of .44 ammunition to go with it, and a couple of empty liquor bottles, just like Mom had said. There was no running water, no bathroom or sink to wash myself in. And from what I could tell, Dad had spent an awful lot of time there, doing something I could not figure out. There was a cot in one corner where Dad had clearly stayed overnight many times. So I dusted it off, tossed my bag onto it, and then took a walk around the area to get a better feel for the place. I wanted to know what had drawn my father to that particular spot. And after seeing all those maps and photos, I had a sense of what might be going on, just not enough to be certain. He had those additions to the cabin built in that specific location for a specific reason, but nothing about the surrounding area gave me any clue as to what was really there. And as far as I was concerned, this was a perfectly ordinary patch of forest, home to nothing more frightening than the occasional bear with her cubs. But that night proved otherwise. After making my way back to the cabin, I made myself some food. Then, as the sun began to set, I started reading the maps scattered around, lit by the glow of my electric lantern. There were also notes written over certain grid squares that said things like, "Found him sleeping here," or "Human scat, feeding?" All of it made me think that my dad had been tracking the man with the red hair. But then there was one note that said, "Almost saw me, too close." The words "too close" had been written in large block letters. That note, along with the gun, made me realize that whatever had happened to him, the red-haired man had somehow posed a threat to my father. And since I was now staying in the cabin, he might pose a threat to me as well. Notes like, "Made contact today," gave me a bit of hope, but others like, "Secondary contact, bad reaction," made me think that sleeping there was not such a good idea after all. Still, knowing it was too late to do anything without risking getting lost in the dark made me feel deeply uneasy. Once it was completely dark outside, I bolted the cabin door shut, closed the small shutter over its only glassless window, and then tried, unsuccessfully, to get comfortable on the canvas cot. That turned out to be nearly impossible for a while. But with the wind moving through the trees in a soft, constant drone, and with the exhaustion from the day's hike finally catching up to me, I eventually drifted off to sleep. I don't know how long I was out, but I was jolted awake around 2:30 in the morning by a noise. My heart started pounding as I looked all around the cabin, trying to find its source. Then I realized, with some relief, that it was coming from outside. Something was moving out there, and at first I thought it had to be an animal, curious and probably drawn by the smell of food. But as I listened more closely, I began to hear a very steady bipedal shuffle that sounded far too confident to be an animal. The first thing I did was reach for the desk where that heavy revolver sat in the drawer. I was not exactly a hotshot with guns, but I knew how to load and operate it well enough to have it ready to fire. An animal would eventually leave, especially after some time or a warning. But a lone person out there in the middle of the night was definitely worth arming myself for. My next move was toward the small shuttered window, which I quickly opened and shined a flashlight through. I had a wide enough arc to light up what was directly in front of the cabin, but not much beyond that. As I scanned the area, the rhythmic shuffling noise sounded like it was getting closer and closer to my line of sight. I swung the flashlight beam toward the trees on my right. Then, after a few seconds of waiting, a person shuffled into view. They were completely naked, with only patches of clean, pale skin visible beneath the layers of dirt and grime. Their long red hair was knotted and wild, and I caught a glimpse of an equally unkempt beard as well. I knew who it was the moment I saw all that hair. But when I shined my flashlight on him, he didn't react at all. He just kept walking sideways toward me, like he was circling the cabin. He continued like that for a minute or two, before he suddenly stopped. At first, all I could do was watch, frozen and silent by what, or more accurately, who, I was seeing. But when the guy paused and stood perfectly still, like some kind of creepy statue, I knew I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I called out to him, saying something like, "Hey, I'm warning you, I've got a gun in here." He didn't react to the sound of my voice either. He stayed almost perfectly still, aside from a very subtle swaying. Then, out of nowhere, he suddenly started sprinting straight toward the cabin door. The way he went from 0 to full speed terrified me. I slammed the shutter closed, backed away from the front wall of the cabin, and pointed the gun directly at the door. I saw those metal plates again, and it suddenly made a horrible kind of sense why they had been added. I thought he was going to throw his weight against the door and try to bash it open, but just as his footsteps got very close, they stopped He seemed to just stand outside the door, quiet and motionless once again. I reminded him that I had a gun, and that breaking into a cabin would be the last thing he ever did. As expected, he didn't say a word in response. There was a dead silence for a minute or two before he started gently knocking on the cabin door. It was very soft and quiet at first, barely audible, but with each repetition, it grew louder and harder. At first, I thought it was his fist, but the longer it went on, the more I realized the impact was much heavier, and it was hitting at exactly head height. That crazy bastard wasn't pounding his fist on the cabin door. He was smashing his head into it over and over again. I remember yelling at him to stop while staring at those metal plates, thinking to myself that this had happened before. As he kept slamming what I assumed was his head into the thick wooden paneling, I started shouting that I wasn't my dad and that he had passed away. I didn't say it exactly like that. It was more drawn out, and I must have sounded terrified. But I made it clear that my dad was gone and that I wasn't staying. The moment I got that point across, the banging suddenly stopped. There was dead silence again for a moment or two, and then I heard a voice outside say my dad's name. It was a raspy kind of croak, like whoever was outside hadn't spoken or had a drink of water in a very long time. But it was clear enough for me to recognize my dad's name. I told the guy for a second time that my dad had passed, and that in the morning I would leave and never come back. But his only response was to croak my dad's name again, a little louder. I yelled at him then, shouting about how my dad was dead, how I didn't know what the hell he'd been involved in, and that I didn't mean anyone any harm by being out there. I expected him to repeat my dad's name again, but instead the silence stretched on until I suddenly heard footsteps growing gradually quieter as whoever it was began to walk away. I remember just standing there, unable to move, but also unable to stop shaking as I listened to those footsteps fade more and more until I couldn't hear them at all. Hearing only silence again felt like a spell being broken. I could move again, but I also couldn't stop moving. There was no way I was sleeping in that cabin that night, not after that. So I packed up my things, made sure I was headed west, and then walked until I saw the sunrise. That night hike was one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life. Not only did I notice that the cabin door was drenched in what looked like saliva on my way out, or possibly blood, but I mistook every small shadow at the edge of my flashlight beam for that naked, red-haired man. The same was true for every sound I heard. I heard an owl or something hooting behind me, and I would spin around on the spot with my flashlight and my dad's gun ready. I honestly thought I was going to have to kill a man that night, and I thank God it didn't come to that. I also didn't feel truly and completely safe until I was back in my car and moving again. By the time I got home, I hadn't slept in more than 24 hours, but I was still so wired from all that adrenaline that I didn't even think about sleeping until late that afternoon. I called the ranger headquarters in Wairika Ranger Station to report what I'd seen, and told them how concerned I was about whoever was out there. I mentioned that I believed my late father had been trying to find a missing person, but I didn't say anything about the tracking or the observation he'd done. I also didn't go into detail about that horrifying encounter from the night before. All I said was that the guy seemed dangerous. I didn't want the ranger thinking I was some kind of crazy attention seeker. Then, when it was his turn to speak, the ranger told me something that shocked me. He said I wasn't the first person to make a report like that about a red-headed wild man living out in those woods. I probably wouldn't be the last either. But so far, he hadn't hurt anyone. He just scared people, especially given his lack of clothing and his clearly strange behavior. The oldest filed report was from 15 years earlier, which coincidentally lined up with the same period when my mom and dad were getting divorced. I asked if my dad's name appeared among any of the people who had filed reports, but the ranger said no. Before we hung up, the ranger suggested the man might have been an old-time friend of my dad's who had gone out there trying to find him. I said it was possible, but I couldn't know for sure. Mom didn't recognize the man's description either, and she couldn't recall my dad ever spending time with anyone who looked like that. That was probably the point when my curiosity was at its strongest. I think there was a stretch of time when I was close to falling into the same trap my father had. I started thinking, why sell the place when I could go out there now and then and piece together what my dad had been trying to understand and build? Then I pictured myself slipping down that same rabbit hole of obsession, empty liquor bottles piling up out there in isolation, until I too died long before my time should have been up. After that, I put the cabin on the market. I had to sell the land and the cabin together as a single parcel, and I sold it at a steep discount because I just wanted everything gone, and because the place was so dilapidated and repulsive. The idea of sending someone out there to evaluate it never even crossed my mind, because I'm not sure I could have lived with myself if they'd gone all the way out there and never come back. That wasn't the only strange story involving isolated cabins I would hear later in life. In 2011, a young boy and his mother vanished during an unplanned road trip, drifting from zoo to hotel as if they were following some private plan. Days later, she was found dead, leaving behind only a chilling note that claimed he was safe, but that no one would ever see him again. More than a decade later, there is still no trace of the boy, only whispers of what might have happened in the shadows of those missing days. In September of 1993, my college friends and I were about to start our junior year when we decided to meet up for a camping trip. We had been talking about it for almost a year, but we never found a time when all four of us could make it work. Before classes started, we finally decided to head out into the boonies for some real Call of the Wild type stuff, as I liked to call it. We chose Olympic National Park, if you're familiar with it, since it was only a couple of hours' drive away, and paired that with Olympic National Forest. They are two different places that border each other, and together they formed one of the largest wilderness areas in the lower 48, right there on our doorstep. We drove out early on Thursday the 2nd, with a plan to drive back to Seattle on Monday the 6th. We were full of energy on the way out, excited for 3 full days of living wild and free. After stopping for lunch, we drove down to a place called Fairhome, where there was a campground by the general store. That was our landing zone, if you will. It was the place where we spent our first night before heading out onto the trails the next morning. From there, we planned to hike out to the lookout, take in the views from our campsite on the mountain, and then lazily make our way back to the car, which was supposed to pass through something like a rainforest, which we had heard felt like stepping onto an untamed planet. I am not joking. The first night was a lot of fun. The next morning, we passed through that rainforest on our hike, confident that we were heading in the right direction. You could not miss the range of hills we were headed for. Getting completely lost felt just about impossible. Eventually, there came a point when we realized we were not on the trails we thought we were. Not that it bothered us much. We knew that if we kept heading mostly west, we would spot the lookout sooner or later. What we did not count on was how thick the trees were. It reached a point where, even though we knew the direction we were going, we had absolutely no idea where we were exactly. After walking through endless trees for what felt like hours, we came across the cabin. It was so worn down and weathered that it was almost camouflaged against the backdrop of trees. The roof was completely covered in dead leaves. Vines crept up one side, and the glass windows were so dirty it almost looked like there were clouds inside. It looked completely abandoned. When we peeked through the windows, we saw the inside was covered with what looked like old camping gear. On a table sat crumpled aluminum foil, a half-empty box of matches, and a dented tin can with a spoon crusted in dried beans. Scattered across the floor were torn granola bar wrappers and a spilled bag of trail mix. There was also an unzipped, stained sleeping bag slumped against one wall, next to a pile of damp firewood that somehow never made it to the cabin's stone fireplace. After pushing open the unlocked door, I saw a deck of playing cards scattered across the floor, as if a game had been abandoned mid-play. And there were faint carvings on the walls as well, things like initials, dates, and a few very crude sketches. We agreed we were looking at some kind of hiker's stopover, and that it would be the perfect place to rest for a few hours before we carried on toward the lookout. After sweeping away some of the trash with our boots and broken branches, we settled in to have some lunch. After sitting on the porch and heating things up with our little camp stove, I decided to explore the cabin a bit. I figured I might be able to salvage something from the debris. Since it was all trash in the main room, I pushed my way into the bedroom to see if there was anything there. One of us had already taken a look, but he had not checked all the drawers in the old nightstand because it was covered in thick cobwebs. The old stained mattress in the corner reeked of rotten mold and dampness, to the point that I almost covered my nose and mouth as I checked the nightstand's drawers. The first thing I saw when I opened the top drawer was what looked like a used condom. I slammed that drawer shut again because it was disgusting. The second drawer held a bunch of empty glass medicine bottles with faded prescription labels. When I opened the third drawer, I found that it contained some kind of leather-bound notebook. I pulled it out, opened it, and saw that it was someone's journal, with the first entry dated 1978. I did not expect it to be very interesting, maybe just something a hiker had forgotten. But after reading that first entry, I was hooked. The journal had been started by someone at the very beginning of what they called the adventure of a lifetime, detailing a plan to live off the grid for the rest of their days. They wrote about how incompatible they felt with modern society, and how they believed they would be much happier out there alone, living off the land. The journal was meant to document their experiences in the hope that it could serve as a guide for others who wanted to escape modernity and embrace nature. As you can imagine, I was pretty psyched to have found something like that. I went from thinking it would be full of awful poems to thinking, damn, I could probably get this published if I tried. I walked back into the main room and told the others what I had found, but not everyone cared. Two of them were too focused on trying to clear the cabin's old chimney and barely reacted to my announcement. My buddy Evan Brooks said, "Really? No way." We sat down on the porch steps and started reading through the journal together. Now, like I said, the first entries mostly detailed what the guy wanted to do, how he planned to do it, and what he hoped to achieve. But as they went on, there was a lot more of the gritty survival stuff I had actually been hoping for. We found the entry from the day the guy ran out of store-bought food and had to rely entirely on what he had been hunting, catching, and foraging. It sounded scary, but exciting too, and it was thrilling to read how happy he was as everything he had worked toward was starting to pay off. But then came the part where he accidentally poisoned himself with some undercooked game, and he got seriously sick for a couple of days. I felt his anxiety when he wrote about how much it had sucked to die from something as pathetic as food poisoning, and we were stoked when we read the entry about how he was starting to feel better again. After reading through a couple more entries, Evan Brooks started to get a little bored, so he wandered off to help the others try to start a fire in the cabin's fireplace. But I kept going, and I will never forget what I ended up reading. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the entries became kind of samey, for lack of a better word. The journal's author followed pretty much the same routine over and over, with only the smallest differences from day to day. That meant I started skipping ahead a lot, trying to find any longer, more interesting entries. I watched his entries from 1979 bleed into those from 1980. As they did, they became less and less frequent. Then, as 1981 slipped into 1982, the style of writing started to change, sometimes quite dramatically too. What were once elegant passages of prose degenerated into something far more primitive. It no longer felt like he was talking to the reader, like you were a friend, but more like he was talking to himself, or trying to speak to God. They became long, rambling tracts about how he could hear the sky sing when it grew really quiet, or how sometimes, when he was killing a rabbit or a pigeon, it felt like he was slaughtering his own self in some strange, protective way. He wrote about how he was no longer out there just to find a new way of living. He was out there to save his soul, caught in some great game between the devil and the Almighty. It was clear that the isolation was starting to make him lose it a little, but he seemed to know it too. He acknowledged how badly it was affecting him, and he knew he needed to spend some time around other people, just to soak up a bit of civilization for a while. But he also wrote about how he couldn't bring himself to do it, how much he'd come to hate regular people, and how wasteful and mindless they were. It was kind of sad to read how this guy's quest to enlighten himself had turned him so bitter and reclusive. But then, as the mid-1980s rolled into the latter half of the decade, the entries weren't just sad anymore. They got downright scary. Some of the later entries were short, clipped, and extremely angry-sounding, with the letters looking like they'd been scratched into the page. Then, in 1989, some of the entries weren't even written in actual script. It was all just squiggles in a shorthand only the writer must have been able to understand. When there were words I could understand, they were mostly curses or strange compound phrases like kill, death, blood god, or sick brain. The author wrote that they were angry at God and that something had gone wrong with the world, something that meant he couldn't play the game anymore. I remember one line that said something jumbled like, "I am not what I am. I am not my offense. I am a cosmic being, and the truth of my rules are the way of the next revealed." I don't think that's what it said word for word, but it was basically the same kind of garbled, almost computer-generated text. Like his internal CPU was going seriously screwy. And there was some other stuff too, but it was mostly variations of, "I am finished. It is finished. I must finish it," over and over again, like he was obsessed with ending something. And that was the last of what I could read. The rest was more of that shorthand, only this time it was a little more intricate and deliberate than the squiggles on the earlier pages. I figured it had to end soon, that at some point he would give up trying to write as he completely lost his mind, or finally abandoned his little quest. But instead, the entries continued, and somehow they got even worse. There were a lot fewer of them, sometimes only once a month. But the entries carried on into 1990, 1991, and 1992. And then, right as I was thinking there was no way this guy had been out here since the 70s, I turned a page and saw the numbers 1993 roughly scrawled above another long trail of symbols and squiggles. And as a reminder, this story takes place in September of that same year. So when I saw that the final couple of entries seemed almost fresh, with cryptic mentions of the approaching fall, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. We weren't at some random hiker's rest stop. We were in some guy's cabin, and that guy was a dangerously insane individual. I rushed inside the cabin and said, "Yo, we have to get out of here, now." And the whole time we had been there, it had been peaceful and quiet. So my friends were completely confused, asking things like, "What? Why? What's going on? What happened?" And I did not have time to explain everything I had read. So I just kept saying, "We should not be here. This is someone's place, and they are crazy." There was still a moment of confusion as they responded, "How could you even know that?" And then I said, "There is this journal. It is their place, and we need to leave." And it was not until I flipped through the later pages to show all the symbols and scribbles that my friends realized how serious I actually was about this. And when everything finally sank in, they stopped trying to light a fire, and we got the hell out of there. It was bizarre how fast the whole mood shifted. One minute, we were just hanging out in this random cabin, completely content with ourselves out there in nature. And then the next, we were walking as fast as we could with our heads on a swivel, praying that we would not run into the person who had written that journal. My buddies kept asking me questions about what I had read, and each answer only made them more and more panicked, wondering what a person like that might have done if they had found us in their own home. We hiked until we were almost completely wiped, and that lookout was finally in sight. Since we were so exhausted, we agreed to climb it in the morning, and then we hiked up the valley a little to put more distance between us and the cabin before setting up camp. And after we set up camp, it was hard to feel normal again. Before we found the cabin, the woods felt like this huge playground. So realizing that dark corners could hold dark and dangerous secrets really put a damper on things. Now, we were not armed, which was a major mistake in retrospect. But we were only out for a couple of days of hiking, and we were not trying to brave some wild frontier like Lewis and Clark with our muskets at the ready. These days, I would never go into the woods without something to protect myself, though. But back then, let's just say we paid for our naivety with the fear we felt that night. We were fairly confident that we were far enough away from the cabin and would not run into its owner. And we were also confident in the numbers, because 4 of us against 1 of him felt like decent odds. But it was easy to feel confident during daylight, and once night set in and we were surrounded by darkness, that confidence disappeared. We huddled around our campfire like every shadow was hiding something dangerous. And I think the anxiety peaked when someone mentioned the possibility of him actually tracking us. The guy had to be crazier than a dog in a cat factory, and there was no doubt he had lived out there long enough to know how to hunt and track game. And we were an unarmed group of 4, having made no real effort to hide our tracks, which meant there was every chance he could have been sneaking up on us through that darkness. And it scared the living hell out of us. We stayed on guard for most of the night. Then, as it neared 11 p.m., I remember a lull settling over the conversation as we all went quiet, staring into the campfire. I was starting to feel a bit relaxed again, because if the crazy guy from the cabin had wanted to track us, he would have caught up by then. I began to think I might have worked myself into a panic over nothing, because there was a real chance that this guy lived way out in the boonies, and only came back to his cabin every so often to, I do not know, sleep on that stinking mattress or whatever. That was when we heard the scream from the other side of the valley. This blood-curdling sound echoed through the trees. The word scream does not fully describe what we heard. It was more like a mix between a howl and a roar. You could hear anger and madness in it, but also a deep sense of pain. Whoever made that noise was not in control of themselves or their mind. Just hearing it scared the hell out of us. The scream had barely faded for more than a split second when one of my friends said, "That's him." There was no argument from anyone else. We knew exactly who made that sound. There was no disputing it. There was also no chance we were going to keep hanging around in that same spot. We put out the fire, packed up our tents and the rest of our gear, and then walked non-stop until we made it back to the general store where we had parked the car. By then, the first light of dawn was creeping over the hills to the east, and just seeing it felt like salvation. We did not say much on the drive back. Someone mentioned that we should have taken the journal with us, sort of as proof that someone out there had completely lost their mind. The rest of us agreed that taking it would have made the guy even angrier than he already was, and that he would have tracked us through the woods if we had stolen from him. But after hearing that scream echo across the valley, I am not sure he could have been any angrier, knowing his home had been disturbed. Even today, I thank God that he did not track us down. I try not to think about what would have happened if that man had found us. I grew up in a small town in Montana, and back when I was in my late teens, I worked as a night porter at some cabins in the mountains. To clarify what that meant, it was basic night watchman work, making sure everything ran nice and smooth. Every so often, someone would call the office to check in late or ask a few questions. We had just gotten a VHS player installed at the office, so the night porters would be less tempted to fall asleep. So I got into the habit of renting tapes before heading into work, so I could watch movies all night. One night, around 1 o'clock in the morning, I was right in the middle of scaring myself half to death while watching Hellraiser, when I heard something moving outside the office. The office had 2 glass panel windows and a door with a glass panel as well, so I could see out into the darkness, but I couldn't see who or what was moving out there. Sometimes people from the city would come out to go stargazing, so it wasn't unusual to have folks walking around late at night. So when I first heard it, I didn't think much of it and just kept watching Hellraiser. But then, about a minute later, I heard it again. This time it sounded closer to the office, so I lowered the volume on the TV and listened in the silence. It didn't sound like human footsteps. It sounded like something creeping along on all fours, and it was getting closer. We kept a loaded gun in the cash safe for reasons you can probably guess, but it also doubled as protection from things coming down off Barren Mountain. So the first thing I did, once I realized something was creeping up on the office, was rush to the safe and grab the gun. I then crept out of the office and into the lobby, which was nothing more than a desk, a chair, and a logbook, along with those big glass windows. As I stared out into the darkness, listening for the source of that shuffling sound, I couldn't see a thing. I kept watching for the reflection of eyes, partly because I'd been scared nearly to death once before when a coyote turned and looked at me out of the darkness, and I almost lost control of myself. But even after grabbing a flashlight and shining it outside, I still couldn't see a damn thing. Then, out of nowhere, a man rose up from the ground beneath the window, and I jumped back and let out a yell. He looked like he had blood staining his mouth and chin, and there was a reddish-brown slime smeared all down the front of his shirt. He dragged a little of it across the window as he tried to steady himself, and then he collapsed back down to the ground. I knew right away that he had to be hurt somehow. So the first thing I did was run to the phone and dial 911. But the dispatcher wanted to know what was wrong with the man, so I ran back to ask him. The dispatcher must have assumed it was alcohol-related, because she told me to ask him what he'd been drinking. I ran outside and asked him the questions, and all he did was groan in response, until I finally caught 2 words. "Number 9. Now I responded, "Is that a drink or something? I don't know what you mean." But again, all he did was groan in pain. I ran back to the phone and told the woman what he had said about number 9. Then it finally hit me. He wasn't talking about a drink. He was talking about cabin number 9. I ran back to the phone, made sure an ambulance was on the way, and then ran straight down to cabin number 9 to check it out. The front door was wide open, and there was more of that reddish-brown vomit on the step. Inside, it looked like something out of a horror movie. There were 3 other people there, 2 passed out on the couch and the floor, and 1 standing on shaky legs over the sink. He was throwing up what looked like a mix of blood and something else into the sink. When he heard me behind him, he said, "Help me, please." Then he slowly sank to the ground to keep himself from falling. I kept asking, "What did you guys drink?" over and over, but all he could do was point toward the table while he continued retching and gagging. There were maybe half a dozen bottles of liquor scattered around the cabin's kitchen and dining area. There was wine on the table and various other drinks on the countertop. It also looked like a big meal might have been eaten. I started to realize it wasn't just one person who drank too much. All four of them were having the same reaction. That meant something they ate had to be seriously past its sell-by date, or they were sick with something I might have been in danger of catching myself. I didn't have time to dwell on that thought. I just made sure not to touch them or any of the vomit. Then I ran back to the office phone to report what I had found. In the end, it wasn't just one ambulance screeching up the path. It was 4. While the paramedics were treating the people from cabin number 9, I called my boss at home to let him know what was happening. He arrived within the hour, and together we joined a growing crowd of guests who had gathered to stare at the scene. The EMTs loaded all 4 sick people onto stretchers. Once they were secured in the back of an ambulance, it sped back down the track with its lights flashing. We could hear the siren kick in as it reached the highway. After everything cleared out, my boss couldn't believe the mess they left behind in cabin number 9. He said it smelled like blood in there, mixed with vomit. It wasn't just blood. He wanted to know what had happened, and when he got to the bottom of it, or as close to the bottom as there was to get, this is what he told me. A woman from Washington State had organized a kind of reunion with some of her old friends, and she just happened to choose our humble cluster of cabins for it. And they all drove out there, happy as could be, bringing wine and food and gifts and all of that. And then, once they were there, the woman who organized the reunion poisoned their food, cut the phone line to the cabin, and then drove all the way back to Washington, while her friends began vomiting and collapsing. That was all the cops knew at the time my boss spoke with them. They didn't know why she had poisoned her old friends, only that she'd used a mix of weed killer and rat poison. And if I hadn't called 911 when I did, they probably wouldn't have survived. Growing up, I always thought my grandfather was a very strange man. He was always very generous with money, and apparently I was his favorite granddaughter. But he was also very cold and distant with me whenever he came to visit. Mom and Dad said that was just how he was. He grew up during the Great Depression. So he had a very hard childhood and devoted his life to the construction company he founded. So while his business sense was excellent, his social skills were clearly lacking. He lived to a ripe old age and left behind a very generous amount of money when he passed. And then, at his funeral, everyone had nothing but kind words to say about him. But the next day, my dad asked me to sit down with him in our living room and asked if I wanted to know the truth. The way he said it scared me at first, because I thought he was about to reveal some dark family secret. But he laughed and assured me that wasn't the case at all. In fact, he wanted to tell me the story of Walter Hale Sr.'s upbringing and how he came to be the man he was. I didn't know much beyond the whole Great Depression part, and it sounded so sad that I never cared to ask. Yet, little did I know, there were parts of Walter Hale Sr.'s childhood that he had forbidden my parents from ever sharing with me. It was hard to imagine why he would do that, if not to hide something deeply shameful or immoral. But as my dad told me the story, everything became clear. So, back when the financial collapse hit and Walter Hale Sr. was still just a kid, my great-grandfather moved his family out of Denver, Colorado, and up into the foothills of the Rockies. They chose a patch of land, cut down the trees, and then set to work building a small log cabin for themselves to live in. Apparently, it was nothing more than a stove, a chimney, and a couple of beds for them to share. Everything else was either outside or simply didn't exist. They'd hunt, fish, and lay traps to earn fresh meat. And they kept a small vegetable patch, and Walter Hale Sr. would sometimes take dried meat and skins into Denver to trade for a few simple luxuries. Life was hard, and they didn't get to enjoy Christmas or birthdays the same way other kids did. But they also didn't know any different. So even in abject poverty, Walter Hale Sr. made some happy memories from that time in his life. At least, until the strangers came. Walter Hale Sr. said they were eating dinner when he heard a group of men outside calling his father out of the cabin. His father told the family to climb out a back window and run for their lives. And as they were running, Walter Hale Sr. said he could hear his father screaming in pain as the strangers broke into the cabin and murdered him. He said that he, his mom, and his sisters wandered the hills for a couple of days, barely eating or sleeping. Then, when they returned to the cabin, his mom made him and his sister wait in the woods for almost a whole day while she buried their father and cleaned up the cabin. After that, at the tender age of just 9 years old, he became the man of the house. He didn't go to school. He didn't get to play like other kids. Walter Hale Sr. worked to put food on their table every day of his life. By the time he was 13, he owned a mule named Chip, and he rode Chip into a small town called Evergreen to work for a construction company based there. That way, they were guaranteed some money to buy food, medicine, and other necessities, instead of relying on what they could hunt and scrounge for. When he wasn't at work, Walter Hale Sr. was either fixing up the cabin or butchering game while his mom cooked and his sister cleaned. He didn't have the time or energy for anything else. And one of the things that caused him the most trouble was the cabin's chimney. Birds liked to nest in it during the summer, and since his father wasn't an expert builder, the construction was far from perfect. So while it needed a good yearly cleaning in early autumn to prepare for winter, the brickwork seemed to get looser and looser with each passing year. In the year of his 18th birthday, just as summer started turning into fall, Walter Hale Sr. got ready to clean that chimney. But this time, no sooner had he jammed the brush up there than a brick came tumbling down into the fireplace, sending soot and ash everywhere. Walter Hale Sr. cursed his bad luck and tried to put the brick back into place, but he realized something was half lodged where it should sit. Walter Hale Sr. thought it was a dead bird and prepared to cover his mouth and nose as he pulled it from the nook. But it wasn't any kind of dead thing blocking the brick from fitting back properly. It was 3 cloth sacks, and inside them were dozens of solid gold coins. Not even his mother knew why those men had shown up and killed his father, and that was part of what made it so terrifying and traumatic for them. But after finding those coins, it all suddenly made sense. No one knows whether Walter Hale Sr. had stolen them, or if someone out there knew he was up in the hills with his stash of gold coins. He did not even tell my great-grandma about them, but finding them up in that chimney changed their lives completely. And within a couple of years, they were living a good life in Denver. After Walter Hale Sr. started a construction company all on his own. All his life, Walter Hale Sr. remembered what it was like being so poor that they barely had a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. So all he did was work, just like he always had, from dawn till dusk, for the sake of his family. And the reason he was always so strangely frosty with me, despite me being his favorite granddaughter who he showered with gifts on birthdays and Christmas, was because I reminded him of his little sister, the one he had been so hungry with while out in the woods after listening to their father's dying screams. And after that, I lost all my resentment toward him. It was not much. I loved my Walter Hale Sr., and I accepted that he had a little thorniness about him. But after I learned why, I forgave him with all my heart. And I hope wherever he is, he feels both my understanding and my forgiveness. Rest in peace, Walter Hale Sr. I love you.